Her light, when family tries to steal your legacy, have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Share your story in the comments, your voice matters, and you are not alone. Like this video, if you believe it is never too late to reclaim your power. The invitation came on cream-colored paper, hand-delivered to my front door on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. My daughter-in-law, Patricia, had written it in her careful script. "Dearest Margaret, Thomas and I would be honored to host you for Sunday brunch at the Grandview Country Club. Please join us at noon. With love." Patricia, I held the invitation for a long moment, feeling the weight of expensive paper between my fingers. In 15 years of marriage to my son, Patricia had never once invited me anywhere without a specific occasion. No birthdays were approaching, no anniversaries, no holidays that required my presence. The autumn air in our little Vermont town carried the scent of burning leaves and wood smoke. I had been raking the front yard of my colonial house when the delivery boy handed me the envelope. My hands were still dusty from the work, and I brushed them clean before opening what felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. Thomas hadn't visited in 3 months. Our phone calls had grown shorter, more distant. When I asked about his work at the investment firm, he gave vague answers. When I mentioned my volunteer work at the Historical Society, he seemed distracted. Patricia was polite but cool, the kind of coolness that never quite thawed, no matter how many Christmas dinners we shared. Standing there in my front yard, surrounded by piles of scarlet and gold maple leaves, I felt something stir in my chest. Not excitement about the invitation, but wariness. The kind of instinct that comes from 72 years of learning when something feels wrong. I should have trusted that feeling. I should have declined politely and spent Sunday morning in my garden instead. But loneliness has a way of making you accept invitations. You know you shouldn't, hoping this time will be different. The Grandview Country Club sat on a hill overlooking the Connecticut River Valley, white columns and manicured lawns, the kind of place where conversations were conducted in hushed tones, and every table setting cost more than most people's weekly groceries. I had been there only once before, for Thomas and Patricia's wedding reception. Thomas met me at the entrance, wearing a navy blazer that looked fresh from the dry cleaner. He kissed my cheek and complimented my dress, a navy blue silk I had bought years ago for special occasions. Patricia appeared moments later, immaculate in a cream-colored sweater set that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She embraced me warmly, or what passed for warmth in Patricia's world. Her smile was perfect, practiced, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. She asked about my drive, about the house, about whether I was staying warm enough as the weather turned cold. The dining room was elegant in the way that whispered old money. Crystal glasses, linen napkins, fresh flowers on every table. Our table overlooked the river, where a few late-season sailboats moved slowly across the water. Thomas pulled out my chair with a flourish I had never seen from him before. The conversation flowed easily at first. Patricia asked about my garden, about the Historical Society's upcoming fundraiser, about my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had been recovering from hip surgery. Thomas discussed the beautiful fall foliage, mentioned a work colleague who had bought a house in the area, commented on the club's recent renovations. I began to relax. Perhaps I had been wrong to feel suspicious. Perhaps they simply wanted to spend time with me, to bridge the growing distance I had felt in recent months. The Eggs Benedict was perfectly prepared, the coffee rich and smooth, the mimosas light and sparkling. But as the meal progressed, I noticed small things, the way Thomas and Patricia exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. The way Patricia's questions about my daily routine seemed almost clinical, as if she were taking inventory. The way Thomas kept steering the conversation toward my house, my possessions, my plans for the future. When the server brought dessert, Patricia leaned forward with the expression she wore when she was about to say something important. "Margaret, Thomas and I have been talking, and we are concerned about you living alone in that big house, especially with winter coming." I set down my fork, the bite of chocolate torte suddenly tasteless. "I have been living alone since your father passed 4 years ago. I have managed just fine. Of course you have, Thomas said quickly. But you are not getting any younger, Mom. What if you fell? What if you had a medical emergency? The house is so isolated, and you don't have any close neighbors. Patricia nodded sympathetically. We have been researching some lovely senior communities in the area. Places where you would have people nearby, activities, medical care if you needed it. You could sell the house and use the money to live comfortably anywhere you chose. The word sell hung in the air like smoke. I looked at my son, at this man I had raised, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, and whose homework I had helped with, whose wedding I had planned, and whose children I had hoped to help raise someday. I don't want to sell the house, I said quietly. It is my home. Your father and I built our life there. All my memories are there. Thomas reached across the table and patted my hand. We understand that, Mom. But you have to be practical. The house is too big for one person. The maintenance costs alone must be overwhelming, and the property taxes keep going up. I manage my finances quite well. Thank you, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I don't need you to worry about my money. Patricia smiled that careful smile again. Of course not, but we love you. And we want to make sure you are safe and comfortable. We have actually already spoken to a real estate agent just to get an idea of market value. Your house is worth much more than you probably realize. The conversation continued around me, but I stopped listening. They had already spoken to a real estate agent. They had already researched senior communities. They had already made plans for my life without asking me. I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. In the mirror, I saw a woman who looked older than her years, suddenly fragile in a way that frightened me. When had I become someone whose opinions didn't matter? When had I become someone whose life could be planned by others? When I returned to the table, Thomas was signing the check with a flourish. We will drive you home, Mom. We have some information we would like to show you. The drive to my house was quiet. Patricia commented on the changing leaves, on how lovely the countryside looked in autumn. Thomas mentioned that the real estate market was particularly strong right now, that it might be a good time to consider making a move. I stared out the window at the familiar landmarks of my neighborhood. The old stone church where I had been married, the general store where I had bought penny candy for Thomas when he was small, the covered bridge where I had taken him to feed ducks from the river bank. At my house, they followed me inside with the eager efficiency of people who had a plan. Patricia admired the antique furniture, the family photographs, the needlepoint pillows I had made over the years. Thomas commented on the crown molding, the hardwood floors, the size of the rooms. They were appraising my home like potential buyers, and I realized that is exactly what they were. Patricia opened a folder she had brought from the car. Inside were glossy brochures for several senior living communities, complete with photos of smiling elderly residents engaged in various activities: tennis, bridge, water, aerobics, book clubs. The facilities looked pleasant enough, but they weren't home. Look at this one, she said, pointing to a brochure for a place called Willowbrook Manor. It is only 20 minutes from our house. You could see us all the time, and look at all the activities they offer. Thomas spread out papers on my dining room table. Market analysis reports, property tax information, estimates of moving costs. Everything was organized, professional, thorough. They had done their homework. If you sold the house at current market value, Thomas said, you would have enough money to live comfortably at any of these places for the rest of your life. You had never have to worry about money again. I looked at the papers, at the neat columns of numbers that reduced my life to a financial transaction. And what happens to the house? Well, Patricia said carefully. We have been thinking about that. Thomas's job requires him to entertain clients, and our current house isn't really suitable for that. If we bought your house, we could keep it in the family. It would be perfect for business entertaining. The truth crystallized in that moment. They didn't want to help me. They wanted my house. They wanted me gone so they could move into the home I had shared with my husband, the home where I had raised my son, the home that held 40 years of my life. I need time to think about this, I said. Thomas gathered up the papers. Of course, take all the time you need. But Mom, please consider it seriously. We are not going to be around forever to help you, and we want to make sure you are taken care of. After they left, I sat in my living room as the afternoon light faded. The house felt different somehow, as if their presence had changed something fundamental. I looked at the photographs on the mantelpiece, at the wedding picture of my husband and me, at the baby pictures of Thomas, at the family portraits taken over the years. In none of those pictures did I look like someone who needed to be managed, someone whose life could be planned by others. I looked like someone who had lived fully, loved deeply, and earned the right to make her own choices. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about the conversation, about the way they had looked at me, about the folder full of brochures that reduced my future to a series of activities and meal plans. I thought about the real estate agent they had already contacted, about the market analysis they had already prepared. In the morning, I called my lawyer. Henry Blackwood had been my attorney for 20 years. He had helped my husband and me write our wills, had handled the estate when Robert passed away, had guided me through the legal complexities of widowhood. He was a man of few words but deep wisdom, and I trusted him completely. "Margaret," he said when I explained the situation, "I am glad you called. What you are describing raises some concerns." We met at his office that afternoon. Henry was in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office was lined with legal volumes and filled with the comfortable clutter of a man who had spent his career helping people protect what mattered most to them. "Tell me about your finances," he said. "Are you having trouble managing them?" "Not at all," I said. "I live comfortably on Robert's pension and my Social Security. The house is paid for. I have savings, investments, no debt. I am not wealthy, but I am certainly not destitute." Henry made notes on a legal pad. "And your health?" "I am 72 years old, Henry. I have some arthritis. My blood pressure is slightly elevated, but I am in good health. I drive, I garden, I volunteer at the Historical Society. I am not an invalid, but they are pressuring you to sell your house and move into senior living. They say they are concerned about my safety, but I think they want the house for themselves." Henry nodded slowly. "Margaret, what you are describing is called financial exploitation of an elderly person. It is more common than you might think, and it often involves family members who convince elderly relatives to make financial decisions that benefit the family, rather than the elderly person." The words hit me like a physical blow. Financial exploitation. I had heard the term before, but I had never imagined it could apply to me. I was educated, competent, independent. I wasn't someone who could be exploited, but perhaps that was exactly what made me vulnerable. "What can I do?" I asked. Henry leaned back in his chair. "Several things. First, you need to make absolutely certain that your legal documents are in order. Your will, your power of attorney, your healthcare directives. We need to make sure that no one can make financial decisions for you without your explicit consent. And second, you need to be very careful about any documents they ask you to sign. Don't sign anything without having me review it first. And if they continue to pressure you, we may need to take more formal steps to protect you." I left Henry's office feeling both relieved and frightened. Relieved that I had legal protection, frightened that I needed it. The woman who had raised Thomas, who had loved him unconditionally, who had sacrificed for him in countless ways, was now being advised to protect herself from him. That evening, I called my friend Dorothy, who lived in the next town over. Dorothy and I had been friends for 30 years, had raised our children together, had supported each other through divorces and deaths and all the challenges that come with living a long life. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to listen carefully." I explained the situation, about the invitation to brunch, about the pressure to sell my house, about my visit to the lawyer. Dorothy listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy or outrage. "Oh, Margaret," she said when I finished. I am so sorry, but I am not entirely surprised. What do you mean? I have seen Patricia at the country club. She has been asking questions about you, about your house, about your financial situation. She has been very subtle about it, but I noticed. My heart sank. What kind of questions? Whether you were having trouble keeping up with the house, whether you had mentioned selling it, whether you were having any health problems. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it sounds like she was gathering information. I am afraid so. Margaret, there is something else. I saw them last week, driving slowly past your house. They didn't stop, but they were definitely looking at it. Like they were evaluating it. I hung up the phone feeling sick. They had been planning this for weeks, possibly months. The invitation to brunch hadn't been spontaneous. It had been the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign to convince me to sell my house and move into senior living. But why? Thomas made good money at his investment firm. Patricia came from a wealthy family. They already lived in a nice house in an expensive neighborhood. Why did they need mine? The answer came to me gradually over the next few days as I thought about conversations we had had over the years. Thomas had mentioned that his job required more client entertaining than he had expected. Patricia had complained about their current house being too small for the kind of parties they needed to host. They had talked about wanting to move to a more prestigious neighborhood, about needing a house that would impress Thomas's colleagues and potential clients. My house would be perfect for that. It was large, beautifully maintained. In a desirable neighborhood, it had a formal dining room, a spacious living room, a library, a garden perfect for outdoor entertaining. Most importantly, it had the kind of established elegance that couldn't be bought, only inherited. They didn't just want my house. They wanted the life that came with it, the social status, the impression of old money, and established roots. They wanted to claim my history as their own, but I wasn't ready to give up my history. I wasn't ready to become a footnote in their story. The next morning, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who was finally recovering from her hip surgery. She was a retired teacher, sharp as a tack, despite being 85 years old, and she had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. I need to ask you something, I said, when she invited me over for tea. Have you noticed anyone watching my house? Anyone who doesn't belong in the neighborhood? Mrs. Chen's eyes sharpened. Why do you ask? I explained the situation, about Thomas and Patricia's pressure to sell, about Dorothy's observations. Mrs. Chen listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. I haven't seen anyone watching your house, she said finally. But I have seen your son's car in the neighborhood more often than usual. Sometimes they park across the street and sit in the car for a while. I assumed they were visiting you. They weren't visiting me. Then what were they doing? I think they were evaluating the house, checking on the neighborhood, making sure it would suit their purposes. Mrs. Chen set down her teacup with a sharp clink. Margaret, I have lived a long time, and I have seen this before. Adult children who decide their parents are no longer capable of making their own decisions. Sometimes they are right, but often they are just impatient for their inheritance. I am not dying, Mrs. Chen. I am not even particularly sick. But you are 72 years old, and you live alone, and you have something they want. That is enough for some people. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to the cemetery where my husband was buried. Robert's grave was in a peaceful section overlooking a small pond, marked by a simple granite headstone that bore his name and the dates of his birth and death. I sat on the small bench beside his grave and talked to him the way I had when he was alive. I told him about Thomas and Patricia, about their plans for my house, about the lawyer's warnings. I told him about feeling invisible, about feeling like my life had become something to be managed, rather than lived. I don't know what to do, I said aloud. I don't want to fight with Thomas, but I cannot let them push me out of my own life. The wind rustled through the trees, and I imagined I could hear Robert's voice in the sound. He had always been practical, always told me to trust my instincts, always supported my decisions, even when they were difficult. "You are right," I said. "I need to fight for myself." That evening, I called Henry Blackwood again. "I want to make sure my house is protected," I said. "What are my options?" "Well," Henry said, "we could set up a trust that would make it very difficult for anyone to force you to sell, or we could make sure your will is ironclad, so that even if something happened to you, the house would go exactly where you wanted it to go." "What if I don't want to leave the house to Thomas?" There was a long pause. "That is certainly your right, Margaret. It is your house, and you can leave it to anyone you choose. But are you sure that is what you want?" I thought about the question for a long time after we hung up. Was I sure? Thomas was my only child, my only family. Despite everything, I loved him. But love didn't mean I had to enable his selfishness or allow him to control my life. The next morning, I called the Historical Society where I volunteered. I asked to speak with the director, a woman named Sarah Williams, who had been trying to establish a local history museum for years, but had never found a suitable location. "Sarah," I said, "I have a proposition for you." We met for lunch at a small restaurant in town. Sarah was a woman in her 40s, passionate about preserving local history, dedicated to education and community service. She had been fighting for years to save important buildings from demolition, to collect and preserve artifacts from the area's past. "My house," I said, "is one of the oldest in the neighborhood. It was built in 1892, and it has been beautifully maintained. It has historical significance, and it has enough space to serve as both a museum and a research center." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Are you thinking of donating it to the society?" "I am thinking of leaving it to the society in my will. I would continue to live there for the rest of my life. But after my death, it would become a museum dedicated to local history. There would be enough money from my estate to maintain it properly." "Margaret, that would be incredible. But are you sure? What about your family?" "My family," I said carefully, "wants me to sell the house and move into senior living. They are not interested in preserving it as a home. They are interested in using it as a tool for social advancement." Sarah nodded slowly. "I understand. And I think your house would make a wonderful museum. But this is a big decision. Are you sure you want to make it now?" "I am sure," I said. "But I don't want to tell anyone about it yet. I want to see how things develop with Thomas and Patricia first." Over the next few weeks, I revised my will. I set up a trust that would protect my house and my assets. I made sure that my medical directives were clear and that no one could make decisions for me without my explicit consent. I took control of my own future. Thomas called several times, asking if I had had a chance to think about their suggestion. Each time, I told him I was still considering it. I wasn't ready to tell him about my real plans yet. Patricia sent me more brochures for senior living communities, along with handwritten notes about how much she thought I would enjoy the activities and the social opportunities. She also sent me articles about the dangers of elderly people living alone, about the importance of having medical care nearby. The campaign was subtle but relentless. They were trying to convince me that I was too old, too frail, too isolated to continue living independently. They were trying to make me doubt my own judgment, my own capabilities. But I wasn't doubting myself anymore. I was getting stronger. One evening in late November, as the first snow began to fall, I was sitting in my living room reading when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. I looked out the window and saw Thomas and Patricia walking toward my front door. They hadn't called to say they were coming. I opened the door before they could knock. "This is a surprise," I said. Thomas looked uncomfortable. "We were in the neighborhood, and we thought we would stop by. We wanted to see how you were doing." "I am doing fine. Would you like to come in?" They followed me into the living room, but they didn't sit down. Patricia looked around the room as if she were seeing it for the first time, taking note of the furniture, the artwork, the layout. "Mom," Thomas said, "we have been thinking about what we discussed a few weeks ago, about the house. We are worried that you are not taking the situation seriously enough. What situation? The situation of you living alone in a house that is too big for you, too expensive to maintain, too isolated for safety. We are worried that you are being stubborn instead of being practical. I felt my temper rise, but I kept my voice calm. I am not being stubborn. I am being selective about who I take advice from. Patricia stepped forward. Margaret, we love you, and we want what is best for you, but we are also being realistic about your age and your limitations. You cannot live independently forever. I am not trying to live forever, I said. I am trying to live on my own terms, for as long as I can. Thomas sighed. Mom, we have been patient, but we cannot wait forever. If you will not make a decision, we may have to make it for you. The words hung in the air like a threat. What do you mean? We mean, Patricia said carefully, that we have been talking to some people about your situation, about whether you are really capable of making these kinds of decisions anymore. I stared at them, understanding finally dawning. You are talking about having me declared incompetent. We are talking about protecting you, Thomas said, even if you don't want to be protected. Get out, I said quietly. Mom, get out of my house. Now they left, but not before Patricia made one more comment. We are doing this because we love you, Margaret. Someday you will understand. After they left, I sat in my living room shaking. Not from fear, but from rage. They were threatening to have me declared incompetent so they could take control of my finances and force me to sell my house. They were willing to destroy my autonomy, my dignity, my independence to get what they wanted. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated me. The next morning, I called Henry Blackwood. They are threatening to have me declared incompetent, I said. What do I need to do? You need documentation that you are mentally competent and capable of making your own decisions. I can arrange for you to be evaluated by a psychiatrist. We can also have your doctor provide a statement about your mental state. And if they try to have me declared incompetent, then we fight them in court. But Margaret, if you are going to fight this, you need to be prepared for a long, difficult battle. And you need to be prepared for the possibility that your relationship with Thomas may never recover. I understand, I said, but I am not going to let them take my life away from me. That afternoon, I called Sarah Williams at the Historical Society. I want to finalize the arrangements for donating my house, I said. I want to make sure everything is legally binding. Are you sure about this? I am sure. And I want to make the announcement at the Society's annual meeting next month. I want it to be public, so there is no question about my intentions. Margaret, this is a wonderful gift, but are you prepared for the consequences? I am prepared for anything, I said. I have been preparing my whole life. The psychiatrist confirmed what I already knew. I was mentally competent, capable of making my own decisions, and not suffering from any form of dementia or cognitive decline. Dr. Amanda Reynolds was a kind woman in her 50s who specialized in geriatric mental health. Her office was warm and comfortable, filled with plants and soft lighting that made me feel at ease. Margaret, she said, as we concluded our session, I want you to know that you are one of the sharpest, most articulate people I have had the pleasure of meeting. Your cognitive abilities are excellent. Your memory is clear, and your decision-making capacity is completely intact. Anyone who suggests otherwise is either misinformed or has ulterior motives. Her words bolstered my confidence, in a way I hadn't expected. I had been so focused on defending myself that I hadn't stopped to acknowledge how sound my judgment really was. Dr. Reynolds provided a detailed written assessment that left no room for interpretation. My family doctor, Dr. Stephen Martinez, whom I had been seeing for 15 years, was equally supportive. Margaret, I have watched you navigate your husband's illness and death with remarkable strength and clarity. You manage your medications perfectly. You attend all your appointments, and you are more organized than patients half your age. If anyone questions your competence, they will have to go through me first. His written statement was equally strong. detailing my excellent physical health, my mental acuity, and my consistent ability to make sound medical decisions. Dr. Martinez noted that I had been making all my own healthcare choices for years, including some difficult decisions about my husband's end-of-life care. Henry prepared the legal documents that would make my donation to the Historical Society ironclad. He also prepared a restraining order that would prevent Thomas and Patricia from harassing me or trying to force me to leave my house. But more importantly, he helped me understand the full scope of my rights as an elderly person. "Margaret," he said during one of our meetings, "what you are experiencing is unfortunately common. Adult children often assume they know what is best for their parents without considering the parents' wishes or capabilities. But you have legal protections, and we are going to make sure everyone understands that." He explained the laws regarding elder abuse, the requirements for declaring someone incompetent, and the penalties for attempting to coerce an elderly person into making unwanted financial decisions. The legal framework was more robust than I had realized, and I felt increasingly confident in my position. I was ready for battle, but more than that, I was ready to live on my own terms. The Historical Society's annual meeting was held in the community center on a cold December evening. About 50 people attended, mostly longtime residents who cared about preserving the town's history. Thomas and Patricia were not among them, but I had expected that. The community center was decorated with holiday lights and garland, creating a warm, festive atmosphere. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a small stage where Sarah Williams had set up a projector to show slides of the Society's accomplishments over the past year. I arrived early and was greeted by familiar faces. Eleanor Hutchins, who had been documenting the town's historic houses for decades, embraced me warmly. "Margaret, I am so glad you are here. I heard you might have some news for us tonight." Word had spread quietly through the Historical Society's network. These were people who understood the value of preserving the past, who had spent years fighting to save important buildings and artifacts from neglect or destruction. They knew that my house was one of the architectural treasures of the town. George Whitman, a retired architect who had volunteered his services to help restore several historic buildings, pulled me aside. "I have been hoping someone would find a way to preserve your house," he said. "The craftsmanship in that place is extraordinary. The original hardwood floors, the hand-carved moldings, the stained glass windows. They don't make houses like that anymore." As the meeting began, I felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. Sarah Williams stood at the podium, her silver hair gleaming under the lights, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. She had been the driving force behind the Historical Society for over 20 years, and her passion for preservation was infectious. "Tonight," she said, "we have a very special announcement. One of our most dedicated volunteers has made a decision that will transform our ability to serve this community for generations to come." Sarah Williams introduced me as someone who had been volunteering with the Society for years, someone who cared deeply about preserving the past for future generations. When she called me to the podium, I felt nervous but determined. The polite applause helped calm my nerves as I looked out at the assembled faces. "I want to tell you about a decision I have made," I said, my voice stronger than I had expected. "A decision that I hope will benefit this community for generations to come." I explained about my house, about its historical significance, about my plans to donate it to the Society after my death. I talked about the importance of preserving our local history, about the need for a place where people could come to learn about the past. My house was built in 1892 by Samuel Morrison, one of the town's early industrialists, I said. It has survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and countless changes in our community. The walls have witnessed celebrations and sorrows, births and deaths, the daily life of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I paused, looking around the room. This house has been my home for 40 years. It is where I raised my son, where I shared my life with my husband, where I have been happiest. I cannot think of a better way to honor that history than to ensure that it continues to serve the community. The applause was warm and sustained. Several people came up to me afterward to thank me, to tell me how much the donation would mean to the town. Sarah Williams had tears in her eyes. "This is the most generous gift the society has ever received," she said. "We will make sure it is used exactly as you intended." Mrs. Chen, who had attended the meeting despite her recent hip surgery, squeezed my hand. "You have done something wonderful," she said. "Your house will live on, and so will your story." Eleanor Hutchins was already making plans. "We will need to document everything," she said excitedly. "Every room, every architectural detail, every piece of history. This will be our flagship property." George Whitman approached me with a notebook full of sketches. "I have been admiring your house for years," he said. "The Victorian Gothic details, the wraparound porch, the tower room, it is a perfect example of late 19th century residential architecture. It will make an incredible museum." That night, I went home to my house feeling peaceful for the first time in months. I had taken control of my own future. I had ensured that my home would be preserved and cherished. I had protected myself from those who would exploit me, and I had done it all on my own terms. Thomas called the next morning. His voice was cold, distant. "I heard about your announcement last night. I thought you might. How could you do this without talking to us first? The same way you could plan to sell my house without talking to me first." There was a long pause. "You are making a mistake, Mom. You are going to regret this." "The only thing I regret," I said, "is that it took me so long to realize what you were doing. We were trying to help you. You were trying to help yourselves. There is a difference." Thomas hung up without saying goodbye. I never heard from Patricia again. I heard through mutual friends that they had bought a house in another town, that Thomas had left his job at the investment firm, that they were having financial difficulties. The irony wasn't lost on me in their eagerness to claim my house for their social advancement. They had overextended themselves, financially, and damaged Thomas's career. Dorothy filled me in on the details when she visited for tea one afternoon in spring. "I heard from Margaret Thornton that Thomas was asked to leave his position," she said carefully. "Something about a conflict of interest with a client. And apparently they bought a house they couldn't really afford, thinking they would have your house to fall back on." I felt a pang of sadness for Thomas, despite everything. He had been a bright child, full of promise, but somewhere along the way, he had lost his moral compass. Patricia's influence had been strong, but Thomas had made his own choices. He had chosen ambition over family, greed over love. "I am sorry for him," I said to Dorothy, "but I am not responsible for his problems." "No," she agreed. "You are not, and you shouldn't feel guilty about protecting yourself." I continued to live in my house, to volunteer at the Historical Society, to tend my garden, and maintain my independence. I made new friends among the society members, people who valued my knowledge and experience, who treated me as a person rather than a problem to be solved. The house began to feel different, lighter somehow. Without the constant pressure from Thomas and Patricia, I rediscovered rooms I had neglected, hobbies I had abandoned, aspects of myself that had been buried under years of trying to please people who couldn't be pleased. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since my 30s. I set up an easel in the tower room, where the light was best, and spent hours capturing the changing seasons outside my windows. The lake in winter, ice-covered and serene. The spring flowers in my garden, bursting with color and life. The summer thunderstorms that swept across the valley, dramatic and powerful. Mrs. Chen and I became closer friends, bonding over our shared experience of aging gracefully, while maintaining our independence. She had faced her own challenges with her adult children, who lived across the country and seemed to think distance gave them the right to make decisions about her life. "My daughter calls me every week," Mrs. Chen told me one afternoon as we sat in her garden. "She tells me I should move closer to her, that I am too old to live alone. But this is my home. My husband is buried here. My life is here. Why should I uproot myself to make her feel better?" I understood completely. "They think they are helping," I said, "but they are really just trying to manage their own anxiety about our mortality." "Exactly," Mrs. Chen agreed. They want to put us somewhere where they can keep an eye on us, where they can feel like they are in control. But we are not ready to be controlled. Dorothy visited more often, sometimes staying for entire weekends. We would cook together, take long walks, attend historical society events, and generally enjoy the kind of friendship that only comes with age and shared experience. "I am proud of you," Dorothy said one evening, as we sat on my porch watching the sunset. "You stood up for yourself when it mattered most. A lot of people our age would have just given in." "I almost did," I admitted. "There were moments when I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I was too old to make my own decisions. But then I realized that feeling unsure doesn't mean being incompetent. It just means being human." I discovered that I had a rich social life when I stopped waiting for family members to include me in theirs. The Historical Society became my second family, a community of people who shared my interests and values. We organized lectures, fundraising events, and educational programs. We lobbied the town council to preserve other historic buildings. We created walking tours and published historical guides. On quiet evenings, I would sit in my living room and look around at the home I had fought to keep. The photographs on the mantelpiece, the antique furniture, the needlepoint pillows, the books I had collected over the years, all of it would someday become part of a museum, a testament to a life well lived. I thought about the women who would come after me, who would face similar challenges from family members who saw them as burdens rather than people. I hoped that my story would encourage them to fight for themselves, to value their own judgment, to refuse to be diminished by others' expectations. The seasons changed, and so did I. I became more confident, more assertive, more willing to speak my mind. I had learned something important in my 72nd year. It is never too late to reclaim your power. It is never too late to stand up for yourself, and it is never too late to choose your own path, even if it means walking away from people you love. The house was quiet around me, but it wasn't empty. It was full of memories, full of purpose, full of the life I had chosen to live. And someday, it would be full of visitors who would come to learn about the past, to understand the lives of the people who had come before them. I had given my house a future, and in doing so, I had given myself one too. 6 months later, I received a phone call from a woman named Jennifer, who introduced herself as the director of the state's Elder Services Division. She had heard about my situation through Henry Blackwood, who had mentioned my case as an example of successful self-advocacy. "I am wondering if you would be willing to speak at a conference we are hosting about elder abuse and exploitation," she said. "Your story could help other older adults who are facing similar situations." I agreed to speak, and the conference was held in the state capitol on a warm spring day. There were about 200 people in attendance, mostly social workers, lawyers, and healthcare providers who worked with elderly clients. The hotel conference room was bright and modern, with large windows overlooking the Connecticut River. I had prepared notes, but when I stood at the podium, I found myself speaking from the heart instead. The words came easily, perhaps because I had lived them so deeply. 2 years ago, I began. I was a 72-year-old widow living alone in the house I had shared with my husband for 40 years. I thought I was safe, secure, surrounded by family who loved me. I was wrong. The audience was quiet. Attentive, I could see some people taking notes, others nodding in recognition. I told my story simply and honestly. I talked about the gradual erosion of respect I had experienced, about the way my son and daughter-in-law had tried to convince me that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions. I talked about the importance of having legal protection, of having trusted friends and advisors, of refusing to be diminished by others' expectations. The hardest part, I said, wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing that I had been complicit in my own diminishment. I had allowed myself to become smaller, quieter, less visible. I had started to believe that my opinions didn't matter, that my experience was irrelevant. I paused, looking out at the audience. But here is what I learned. Your worth doesn't decrease with age. Your voice doesn't become less important because you are older. Your right to make your own decisions doesn't expire when you reach a certain birthday. The applause was warm and sustained. During the break, people approached me to share their own stories and ask questions. A young social worker named Amanda told me about her grandmother who was facing similar pressure from family members. An elderly gentleman named Robert described his battle with his daughter over his finances. "What you said about being complicit in your own diminishment," Amanda said. "That really resonated with me. I see it all the time in my work. Older adults who have been told so often that they are a burden that they start to believe it." After my presentation, several people came up to me to share their own stories. A woman named Ruth told me about her daughter who had tried to force her to sell her house and move into assisted living. A man named Frank described how his son had tried to take control of his finances after his wife died. "The hardest part," Ruth said, "is that you love them. You want to believe they have your best interests at heart. It takes a long time to realize that they don't." I nodded, understanding completely. "The love doesn't go away," I said, "but you learn to love them without sacrificing yourself." A woman named Claire, who appeared to be in her 80s, had been sitting in the front row throughout my presentation. She approached me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "I have been fighting with my family for months. They want me to move into a nursing home, but I am not ready. I am not sick. I am not confused. I just live alone, and they don't like it. Your story gives me hope that I can stand up for myself." I took her hands in mine. "You can," I said, "you absolutely can, but make sure you have legal protection. Get a lawyer. Get medical documentation of your competence, and don't let anyone pressure you into making decisions you are not ready to make." Claire nodded, pulling out a small notebook to write down the advice I gave her about finding legal help and building a support network. That evening, I returned to my house feeling energized and purposeful. I had found a new role for myself, a new way to use my experience to help others. I began speaking regularly at conferences and workshops, sharing my story and encouraging other older adults to advocate for themselves. The speaking engagements became a regular part of my life. I spoke at senior centers, community organizations, legal aid clinics, and healthcare conferences. Each time, I met people who were facing similar challenges, who needed to hear that they weren't alone and that they had options. I developed a standard presentation that I refined over time, but I always tried to leave room for questions and personal stories. The interaction with the audience was often the most powerful part of the event. At one conference in Boston, I met a woman named Helen who had been forced to sell her house by her son, who convinced her she had dementia. She didn't have dementia. She had been grieving her husband's death and was temporarily confused and disoriented. But by the time she realized what had happened, it was too late. Her house was sold, and she was living in a care facility she didn't need. "I wish I had heard your story 2 years ago," Helen said. "I might have fought harder for myself." Her story haunted me, but it also motivated me. I began working with elder law attorneys to develop educational materials for older adults and their families. We created brochures about elder rights, checklists for recognizing financial exploitation, and guides for building support networks. I also started a monthly support group at the community center, where older adults could come to share their experiences and get advice from others who had faced similar challenges. The group grew quickly, attracting people from several surrounding towns. One of our regular attendees was a man named Walter, whose children had been pressuring him to stop driving, even though he had passed all his medical tests and had an excellent driving record. Through our discussions, he learned about his rights and found the courage to stand up to his family. "I have been driving for 60 years, he told the group one evening. "I am not going to stop just because my kids are nervous. When I am no longer safe behind the wheel, I will be the first to know." Another regular was a woman named Joyce, whose daughter had been trying to convince her to give up her volunteer work at the animal shelter. The daughter claimed Joyce was too old to handle the physical demands of caring for animals. But Joyce was healthy and passionate about her work. "My volunteer work is what keeps me young," Joyce said. "It gives me purpose, and keeps me connected to the community. I am not giving it up just because my daughter thinks I should be sitting at home knitting. The Historical Society thrived with the promise of my future donation. Sarah Williams used it to secure grants and donations from other community members. Plans were made for converting the house into a museum after my death, with exhibits about local history and a research library for genealogists and historians. I lived to see the groundbreaking for the museum's expansion, to help plan the exhibits, to work with the curators who would eventually manage the collection. I lived to see my house become a center of community activity, a place where school children came to learn about the past, and where researchers came to study local history. The museum project became a source of great pride for the entire community. Local businesses donated materials and services, volunteers helped with the planning and preparation, and the town council provided additional funding for the research library. I worked closely with the curators to ensure that the exhibits would tell the complete story of the house and its inhabitants. We included information about the original builder, Samuel Morrison, and his family. We documented the changes the house had undergone over the years, the different families who had lived there, and the role it had played in the community's development. But we also made sure to include the story of how the house had been preserved, how an elderly woman had fought to protect her home and her independence, and how that struggle had become a symbol of dignity and self-determination for older adults everywhere. Thomas and Patricia never contacted me again. I heard through mutual friends that they had moved to Florida, that Thomas had started his own business, that they were doing well financially. I was glad for their success, but I didn't miss their presence in my life. Years passed, and I found myself thinking less about the pain they had caused, and more about the strength I had discovered in myself. The woman who had been pressured to sell her house and move into senior living had become an advocate for elder rights, a guardian of local history, a person who mattered in her community. On my 75th birthday, the Historical Society threw a celebration at my house. It was a beautiful autumn day, with the maple trees in full color and the air crisp and clean. Sarah Williams had organized everything, inviting society members, community leaders, and some of the people I had met through my speaking engagements. "This is a celebration of Margaret's life and her gift to our community," Sarah said, as she raised a glass of apple cider. "But it is also a celebration of the courage it takes to stand up for yourself and the wisdom that comes with age." The party was everything I could have wanted. People toured the house, admiring the architecture and the antiques, learning about the history of the building and the community. Children from the local school performed a play about the early settlers, and a local historian gave a talk about the importance of preserving the past. But the moment that touched me most was when Mrs. Chen, now 88 and moving with the help of a walker, stood up to speak. "I want to tell you about my friend Margaret," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. 3 years ago, she was facing a choice that many of us will face someday. She could have taken the easy path, the path that others wanted her to take. Instead, she chose the difficult path, the path that required courage and sacrifice and faith in herself. She paused, looking directly at me. "Margaret taught me that growing old doesn't mean becoming powerless. It means becoming more selective about how we use our power. She showed me that we don't have to accept other people's limitations on our lives." The applause was warm and sustained. But more than that, it was respectful. These people understood what I had been through, what I had risked, what I had gained. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing on the porch with Dorothy and Sarah, watching the last of the autumn light fade over the valley. "Do you ever regret it?" Dorothy asked quietly. "The decision to give up your family relationship to keep your independence?" I thought about the question for a long moment. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that Thomas and Patricia couldn't respect my choices, but I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret choosing dignity over convenience." Sarah nodded. "You have given so many people permission to make the same choice," she said. "Your story has helped dozens of elderly people find the courage to advocate for themselves. And you have given this community an incredible gift," Dorothy added. Your house will be here long after we are all gone, teaching future generations about the importance of preserving history and standing up for what is right. That night, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, surrounded by the flowers and cards that people had brought for my birthday. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, full of satisfaction and contentment. I had discovered that growing older didn't mean becoming invisible. It meant becoming more selective about who deserved your attention, more protective of your energy, more intentional about how you spent your time. I had learned to value my own judgment above the expectations of others, to trust my instincts even when they led me away from conventional wisdom. The woman who had been pressured to sell her house and move into senior living had become an advocate for elder rights, a guardian of local history, a person who mattered in her community. I had not just survived the attempt to exploit me, I had thrived in spite of it. My house remained my sanctuary, my place of peace and purpose. Every morning, I would sit in my living room with my coffee and look around at the home I had fought to keep. Every evening, I would walk through the rooms, touching the furniture and the photographs, grateful for the life I had chosen to live. And every day, I woke up in my own house, in my own bed, living my own life on my own terms. It was a victory worth fighting for. A victory I had earned through courage, wisdom, and the unwavering belief that I deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. The mirror by my chair reflected not just my face, but the face of a woman who had learned to see herself clearly, to value herself appropriately, and to defend herself effectively. I was no longer someone who could be erased from family photographs or manipulated into making decisions against my best interests. I was Margaret, 75 years old, keeper of history, defender of rights, and proof that it is never too late to reclaim your power and live life on your own terms. If you have ever felt overlooked or made to feel small by your own family, Margaret's story reminds us that it is never too late to reclaim your power and dignity. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is choosing yourself with wisdom and quiet strength. What would you have done in Margaret's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and you deserve to be heard. Don't forget to subscribe to her light for more stories of strength and resilience.